I didn't wake up planning to question my relationship. I wasn't looking for attention. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I was just tired in the normal, adult sense of the word. Then I had one conversation, nothing inappropriate, nothing physical, nothing I thought I'd remember. But I went home feeling seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I'm a woman in my early 30s, in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We live together. We share bills, routines, future plans, all the things people assume mean everything is fine. I wasn't searching for problems. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I wasn't bored enough to risk what I had built. That's why it scared me how quickly one ordinary conversation made me realize something I had been avoiding. I had been lonely for a long time, and I hadn't even noticed when it started. If you've ever felt something shift quietly inside a relationship, I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think loneliness inside a relationship really looks like? And if you enjoy real, honest stories like this, consider subscribing and sharing. It helps these conversations reach the people who need them. The conversation itself was ordinary enough that I didn't even mention it to my partner that night. It happened in the middle of a normal day. During a break I almost skipped. We talked about work, stress, the small frustrations adults trade like currency. Nothing personal, nothing flirtatious. At least not on the surface. What caught me off guard wasn't what he said. It was how he listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fix anything. He didn't turn it into a joke or a solution. He just stayed there, focused. What I was saying actually mattered. I remember stopping mid-sentence because I wasn't used to finishing my thoughts anymore. At home, conversations had become efficient, practical, reduced to logistics and updates. Somewhere along the way, my feelings had been filed and understood already. This wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about chemistry. It was about realizing I'd been speaking at half volume in my own relationship for years. When I got home that evening, my partner asked how my day was. I said, "Fine." And for the first time, I felt like I was lying. Not because something had happened, but because something had shifted. That night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection and thought something that scared me. When was the last time I felt fully heard by the person sleeping next to me? I didn't know the answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to look for it. Was I wrong for letting that conversation mean something to me? Would you have brushed it off, or questioned your relationship the way I did? Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. People talk, people listen. That's normal. I told myself I was projecting, that maybe I was just tired, or stressed, or going through one of those quiet phases relationships slip into when life gets heavy. I reminded myself of all the good things my partner did. The stability, the loyalty, the shared history, the way he showed up when it mattered in practical ways. But none of that erased the feeling that had settled in after that conversation. What bothered me wasn't missing the other person. I didn't think about him constantly. I wasn't replaying his words like a secret soundtrack. What bothered me was how aware I had become of what was missing at home. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. How often my partner checked his phone while I was talking. How quickly conversations turned into problem-solving instead of understanding. How my emotions were met with reassurance instead of curiosity. The goal was to move past them as fast as possible. One night, I tried to explain how overwhelmed I had been feeling lately. I didn't mention the conversation. I just wanted to feel that same sense of being heard. He nodded. He hugged me. He told me everything would be okay. And somehow, that made me feel even more alone. I realized then that my loneliness wasn't loud. It didn't come from neglect or cruelty. It came from being consistently misunderstood in small, almost invisible ways. That's when the guilt started. Because nothing bad had happened. No boundaries had been crossed. No promises broken. Yet here I was, emotionally unsettled, comparing the way one person listened to the way my partner didn't, and hating myself for even noticing the difference. Late that night, I opened my phone and hovered over a message I hadn't planned to send. Not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted to confirm something for myself. I wanted to know if that moment had been real, or if I was imagining the connection entirely. My thumb stayed there longer than it should have. At what point does noticing what's missing turn into betraying what you have? Would you have stopped yourself? Or sent the message just to be sure? I didn't send the message that night. I put my phone down and told myself that was proof of something. Proof that I still had control. That I wasn't the kind of person who let curiosity spiral into damage. I went to sleep feeling uneasy but proud, like I had quietly passed a test no one else knew I was taking. But the next morning, the feeling was still there. It wasn't louder. It wasn't dramatic. It was just persistent. On the surface, my relationship continued exactly as it always had. We talked about errands, weekend plans, work deadlines. We laughed at the same shows. We moved around each other with the comfort of people who know every corner of the same space. And yet, I felt like I was watching myself participate instead of actually being present. I realized something uncomfortable. I had started editing myself before speaking, choosing simpler versions of my thoughts, keeping things lighter, deciding what was worth bringing up and what would just lead to another well-meaning but shallow reassurance. I told myself I was being considerate. I told myself I was avoiding unnecessary conflict. But deep down, I knew I was doing it because it was easier than feeling unheard again. Later that day, I ran into the same person by chance. We exchanged a few words, polite, brief, unremarkable. But again, he looked at me like he was actually listening, even when I wasn't saying anything important. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't craving him. I was craving the version of myself that spoke freely without preparing to be misunderstood. That realization scared me more than attraction ever could, because it meant the problem wasn't external. It meant I couldn't fix this by avoiding one person or setting clearer boundaries. The problem lived inside my relationship, and inside me. That night, my partner talked about something stressful that had happened at work. I listened. I asked questions. I stayed present. And when there was a pause, I almost said something honest about how disconnected I'd been feeling. Almost. Instead, I swallowed it. Again, later, alone in bed, I picked up my phone. Not to message anyone, but to scroll, to distract myself from a thought I didn't want to finish forming. What scared me was how easy it would be to open a door I hadn't meant to knock on. Was I protecting my relationship? Or just avoiding a harder conversation at home? Do you think silence can be its own kind of betrayal? The days that followed felt heavier, even though nothing on the outside had changed. That was the strangest part. There was no fight. No cold silence. No obvious cracks. If anything, our relationship looked calm, functional, even healthy to anyone watching from the outside. But inside, I felt like I was carrying a quiet secret. Not about another person, but about myself. I started noticing how often I minimized my own reactions. When something bothered me, I framed it as not a big deal, before my partner even had a chance to respond. When I felt disappointed, I softened it into humor. When I felt disconnected, I blamed stress, timing, anything except the truth. The truth was harder to say out loud. I didn't feel unsafe. I didn't feel unloved. I just didn't feel met anymore. One evening, while we were making dinner, my partner talked about plans for the next few years, where we might live, what we might change, what would stay the same. He spoke with confidence, with certainty, like the path was already clear. I nodded along, adding comments at the right moments. On the outside, I looked engaged. On the inside, I felt a strange distance from the future he was describing, like I was listening to a story I was supposed to recognize as mine, but didn't fully see myself in. That scared me more than anything else had so far. Later that night, lying in bed, I thought about the conversation that had started all of this. I replayed it, not because it was special, but because it had revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. It showed me how long it had been since someone had asked me a question and actually waited for the answer. I wondered when my partner and I had stopped doing that for each other. And then a thought crossed my mind that made my stomach tighten. What if this wasn't a phase? What if this wasn't about being tired or stressed? What if this was simply who we had become together? That's when the temptation shifted. It stopped being about another person entirely. It became about the possibility of feeling understood again. By anyone. I caught myself imagining what it would be like to talk freely, without editing, without translating my feelings into something more manageable. Not with someone specific, but with the idea of being fully seen. And I hated myself for how comforting that idea felt, because once you admit you're lonely inside a relationship, you're forced to confront a question you can't ignore forever. Do you try harder to fix it? Or do you admit that wanting more doesn't automatically make you wrong? That night, my partner fell asleep quickly. I lay there longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, aware of how much space can exist between two people sharing the same bed. Was I being unfair for wanting something I couldn't clearly define? Or is staying quiet sometimes more damaging than saying the thing that could change everything? The days that followed felt heavier, even though nothing on the outside had changed. That was the strangest part. There was no fight, no cold silence, no obvious cracks. If anything, our relationship looked calm, functional, even healthy to anyone watching from the outside. But inside, I felt like I was carrying a quiet secret, not about another person, but about myself. I started noticing how often I minimized my own reactions. When something bothered me, I framed it as not a big deal, before my partner even had a chance to respond. When I felt disappointed, I softened it into humor. When I felt disconnected, I blamed stress, timing, anything except the truth. The truth was harder to say out loud. I didn't feel unsafe. I didn't feel unloved. I just didn't feel met anymore. One evening, while we were making dinner, my partner talked about plans for the next few years, where we might live, what we might change, what would stay the same. He spoke with confidence, with certainty, like the path was already clear. I nodded along, adding comments at the right moments. On the outside, I looked engaged. On the inside, I felt a strange distance from the future he was describing, like I was listening to a story I was supposed to recognize as mine, but didn't fully see myself in. That scared me more than anything else had so far. Later that night, lying in bed, I thought about the conversation that had started all of this. I replayed it, not because it was special, but because it had revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. It showed me how long it had been since someone had asked me a question and actually waited for the answer. I wondered when my partner and I had stopped doing that for each other. And then a thought crossed my mind that made my stomach tighten. What if this wasn't a phase? What if this wasn't about being tired or stressed? What if this was simply who we had become together? That's when the temptation shifted. It stopped being about another person entirely. It became about the possibility of feeling understood again, by anyone. I caught myself imagining what it would be like to talk freely, without editing, without translating my feelings into something more manageable. Not with someone specific, but with the idea of being fully seen. And I hated myself for how comforting that idea felt. Because once you admit you're lonely inside a relationship, you're forced to confront a question you can't ignore forever. Do you try harder to fix it? Or do you admit that wanting more doesn't automatically make you wrong? That night, my partner fell asleep quickly. I lay there longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, aware of how much space can exist between two people sharing the same bed. Was I being unfair for wanting something I couldn't clearly define? Or is staying quiet sometimes more damaging than saying the thing that could change everything? By the time I accepted that something had to change, I was already exhausted, not from arguing, not from conflict, but from the constant internal negotiation, deciding what to say, what to swallow, what to postpone for a better moment that never seemed to come. I started to feel disconnected, even during moments that were supposed to bring us closer. Date nights felt scripted. Affection felt automatic. I noticed how often I smiled without actually feeling present, how often I reassured myself that this was just what long-term relationships looked like. Maybe this was normal, maybe this was adulthood. But then I'd remember that one conversation, not the person, but the feeling. And the contrast would hit me all over again. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to feel unseen, until I felt seen again, even briefly. That's when I decided I needed clarity, not comfort. I didn't want to slowly drift into something dishonest. I didn't want to wake up one day and realize I had crossed a line without remembering when or why. More than anything, I didn't want to become someone who justified her choices after the damage was already done. So I tried to talk to my partner, not in an accusatory way, not with a list of complaints, but honestly, vulnerably. I told him I'd been feeling disconnected, that I missed feeling emotionally close, that sometimes I felt like we were living parallel lives instead of sharing one. He listened. He didn't get defensive. He didn't dismiss me. And yet, something was missing. He reassured me that he loved me, that things were fine, that every relationship goes through phases. He promised to try harder, though he didn't ask what harder actually looked like to me. I walked away from that conversation with mixed emotions, relief for having finally spoken up, and frustration because the core of what I was trying to say still felt untouched. It was then that I understood how two people can hear the same words and walk away with completely different interpretations. Later that night, my phone buzzed, a message from the other person, simple, friendly, unloaded with expectation. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, not because I wanted to escape my relationship, but because I wanted to escape the version of myself that felt invisible inside it. I didn't reply right away, but I also didn't delete the message, and that pause, that hesitation, told me more about myself than any conversation had so far. Had I done enough by speaking up once? Or was I already choosing the easier path by holding on to an emotional backup instead of demanding real change? That hesitation stayed with me longer than the message itself. I went to bed that night, telling myself I had done the right thing. I had spoken up. I had been honest. I had given my partner a chance to understand what I was feeling. That should have been enough, at least for now. But honesty doesn't automatically bring relief. Instead, I felt exposed, like I had opened a door and realized I didn't know what I was hoping to find on the other side. Over the next few days, I paid close attention to my partner, looking for signs that something had shifted, small changes, different questions, a deeper curiosity about how I was actually doing. There were moments that almost convinced me things were improving. He checked in more often. He hugged me longer. He asked how my day had been and waited for the answer. And yet, beneath that effort, I sensed something else. Confusion. It was as if he was trying to fix a problem he didn't fully understand, following instructions without seeing the bigger picture. He wanted reassurance that we were okay, while I was still trying to figure out whether okay was enough for me anymore. That realization made me feel selfish. I had a good partner, a stable relationship, a life many people would envy. Who was I to want more when nothing was technically wrong? And that guilt pushed me back into silence. Meanwhile, I noticed how carefully I handled my phone. Not because I was hiding messages, but because I was aware of how much they meant to me. How even a neutral exchange could lift a weight off my chest, simply by letting me be unfiltered for a moment. I hated that. I hated needing that space. I hated how validating it felt. I hated how easily it fit into my day. I wasn't building a secret relationship. I wasn't sharing intimate details. I wasn't crossing obvious lines. But I was starting to compartmentalize parts of myself, and that felt dangerous in a quieter, harder to define way. One evening, my partner mentioned how relieved he felt that we had cleared the air. He said it casually, like the issue had been addressed and resolved. I nodded, even though something in me tightened, because I didn't feel resolved. I felt paused. That night, lying next to him, I realized I had reached an uncomfortable crossroads. I could either push harder for a kind of connection my partner didn't seem to fully grasp, or I could keep finding emotional relief in places that asked nothing of me. Neither option felt clean. Neither option felt fair. And for the first time, I wondered whether staying meant I was slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who chose comfort over honesty. Do you think emotional distance can exist even when both people believe they're trying? At what point does staying quiet stop being patience and start being self-betrayal? I didn't realize how much I was carrying until something small finally broke me. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was an ordinary evening, the kind we'd shared hundreds of times before. We were sitting together after dinner, half watching something neither of us was really interested in. I leaned my head on his shoulder, hoping for that familiar sense of comfort. He wrapped an arm around me, absent-minded, his attention still on the screen, and suddenly I felt unbearably far away, not physically, emotionally. I pulled back without meaning to, and he noticed. He asked if I was okay, his voice calm. concerned in the way people are when they sense something but don't know what to do with it. I said yes, automatically. The lie came out so easily that it scared me. Later, in the quiet of the bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a wave of frustration I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet. I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't disappointed in some dramatic sense. I was tired of constantly translating myself into something easier to digest. I thought about how much effort I put into keeping things smooth, how often I chose peace over honesty, how often I convinced myself that wanting more emotional depth was asking too much. And then I wondered something I hadn't dared to ask before. What if this wasn't about him failing me, but about me outgrowing the version of the relationship we had settled into? That thought felt disloyal, ungrateful, almost cruel. But it wouldn't go away. I realized I had been shrinking parts of myself to keep the relationship comfortable. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just gradually, over time, until I barely noticed the loss. And the scariest part was this. I didn't know if my partner could meet me where I was now, or if he even wanted to. That night, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't message anyone. I just sat with the discomfort, letting it settle instead of distracting myself from it. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where nothing changed. And instead of feeling safe, I felt empty. That's when I understood that avoiding pain doesn't mean avoiding damage. Sometimes, it just delays it. Is it wrong to question a relationship that feels safe but incomplete? Have you ever realized too late that comfort was costing you something important? After that night, I stopped pretending I didn't know what was happening. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't just tired. I wasn't overthinking a harmless phase. I was standing at the edge of a truth I had avoided for a long time. Over the next week, I moved through my days with a strange clarity. Nothing felt urgent, but everything felt significant. Every interaction with my partner carried more weight. Every silence felt louder. Every small misunderstanding lingered longer than it used to. I noticed how often we talked around things instead of through them. When I shared something emotional, he responded with reassurance instead of curiosity. When I expressed doubt, he offered stability instead of exploration. He wasn't dismissive, he was practical, and I started to understand that practicality was how he loved. The problem was that it wasn't how I needed to be loved anymore. That realization brought an unexpected wave of grief. I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't blaming him. I was mourning something quieter. The version of us I had hoped we could still become. At the same time, I became more aware of how carefully I managed my own honesty. I filtered my words. I softened my tone. I avoided going too deep too fast, afraid of overwhelming him or pushing him away. And that's when I asked myself a question I couldn't ignore. If I have to constantly edit myself to keep the peace, whose peace am I really protecting? One evening, my partner mentioned future plans again. Trips we might take, changes we might make, how stable everything felt. He spoke with confidence, with certainty, like we were aligned simply because we had been together for so long. I smiled and nodded, but inside, something broke, because I realized I had stopped picturing myself in that future the way he did. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I couldn't see where I fit emotionally in the life he was describing. Later that night, I picked up my phone and opened the message thread I had been avoiding. I didn't type anything. I didn't reread old messages. I just stared at the empty space where a reply could go. The temptation wasn't about connection anymore. It was about honesty. It was about how easy it would be to be fully myself without explanation. And that terrified me, because I finally understood that the biggest decision in front of me wasn't about another person at all. It was about whether I was willing to confront the truth of my relationship, even if doing so meant changing everything. Was I wrong for questioning a relationship that still felt safe? At what point does staying become a choice driven by fear rather than love? I didn't make the decision all at once. There was no dramatic moment, no final argument, no clear breaking point. What happened instead was quieter and harder. One morning, we were sitting across from each other, drinking coffee in near silence. It was comfortable in the way routines often are, familiar, predictable. And suddenly, I realized something with painful clarity. I couldn't remember the last time I had shared a fear with him without immediately downplaying it. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep going the way we were. Later that day, I asked him to talk. Not casually, not in passing. I told him I needed him to really listen, not to fix, not to reassure, not to explain it away. I told him the truth. I told him I felt lonely. I told him I felt unseen. I told him I didn't feel emotionally met anymore, even though I still cared deeply for him. I made it clear this wasn't about another person. I didn't bring up the conversation that had started everything. I focused on what mattered, what was happening between us. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, he admitted he hadn't realized how far apart we had grown emotionally. He said he loved me. He said he was willing to try, but he also said something that stayed with me. I don't know if I'm the person you need me to be. That honesty hurt more than any argument could have, because it forced me to confront a truth I had been dancing around for months. Love doesn't always mean compatibility, especially as people change. We didn't decide everything that day. There were tears, long pauses, unanswered questions, but something shifted. For the first time, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't editing myself. I wasn't seeking emotional relief elsewhere. I was standing fully inside my truth, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. Whether our relationship survives or not is still unfolding, but I know this much. Choosing honesty, even when it threatens stability, changed how I see myself. I stopped being afraid of the person I was becoming, because she was finally telling the truth. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.